Welcome everyone, good morning to this talk about building your first Symfony2 application. Now the obvious first question I will have for you is how many of you actually have worked with Symfony before? How many of you have worked with Symfony2 before? Okay, how many of you have worked with Symfony1 before? That's all the same people. Okay, I'm not sure what you guys are going to want to get out of this talk because it will be very basic, but we'll see. Maybe you can have some really hard questions for me. If you want to ask questions, just interrupt me. Don't save them up until the end because that probably means you either forget about it or I will forget about what you are referring to. Most important, I just added this slide because I think Wes didn't mention it, is the Wi-Fi password. The password is event. It's a very secure password. And I think it's like Glazier's whole Wi-Fi is the network name. So then now that you're connected to the internet, we can start. Let me first introduce myself. I don't recognize a lot of faces in this room, so I'm guessing you guys might not know who I am. I'm Stefan Koopmanschap. I'm from the Netherlands. I have been a PHP developer since somewhere 97, 98. I don't remember exactly when. I just know it was PHP 3 that was out back then, which is quite horrible if you compare it to what we have right now with PHP. I've been a Symfony developer somewhere since 06 or 07. Symfony 1.0 wasn't out yet. I can remember that one. I was working for a company building this software as a service application, and we decided to migrate from Joomla to Symfony, which was the best choice ever. I'm sort of a community addict. I've been involved in starting PHP Benelux, and I've been involved in starting PHP Amersfoort, which is a local user group. And up until last week, I was part of the PFZ.nl crew organizing PF Congress, which is a conference in Utrecht in the Netherlands. I run my own company called Ingewikkeld, and together with a friend of mine, I run a training company called Academy. Both are in the Netherlands, although we work for clients worldwide. So if you're interested in Symfony development, consulting, training, whatever, just let me know. Now, first things first, when I submitted to SymfonyLive, I submitted this talk actually as a tutorial for the tutorial day yesterday. Somehow it got accepted as a talk, so the description on the website actually implies that we're all going to be developing today, which, since we only have 15 minutes, is not going to happen. But if you're interested in the full tutorial, in 2 weeks' time in Manchester, there's PHP Northwest. And I will be doing this as a tutorial over there. So there you can actually go and sit down with your laptop and we're going to actually hack your first application together. The conference is sold out, but I think there are still tutorial tickets left. So if you're still interested in that, just go to, I think it's conference.phpnw.org.uk. So what I will be talking about today is basically 6 steps to creating a first very basic Symfony2 application. It will be very basic because, well, I only have 50 minutes, but at least I will try to get you introduced into most of the basic aspects that you will need to build your own Symfony2 application. The first step is choosing your framework. Now for this talk, obviously, we've already made that choice, but I still will talk about this. Then you'll create your project. You'll be creating first Hello World. Then I will be talking about connecting to a database. I will be talking about Twig a bit. And then I'll be talking about Forms a bit. These are the basics to get just a basic application up and running. Once you're done with this, you know how to basically build an application and how to extend it. If I have some time left, I'll actually show you the demo application that I've built for these slides as well. We'll have to see how much time we have left. So step 1, choosing your framework. Obviously for this talk we've already chosen Symfony, but I think it's important to realize Symfony is not the only framework out there. And Symfony might not be the right choice for every project you do. I did a project last year for a big client in the Netherlands where most of the stuff that needed to be done was basically cron jobs that would run every minute, which is not web-based at all. So instead of using the full Symfony, I picked the Silex framework, C-I-L-E-X, which is a command line framework based on Symfony components, but it only gives you a subset of the whole of Symfony, which made more sense because I don't need all of that if I just will use this small part. So you should be able to look at the project and see what it requires and then decide whether you want to use Symfony or Zen Framework or Silex or Silex or whatever other framework that's out there. There's a couple of frameworks that you shouldn't choose, but okay, I'm not going there. The choice here obviously was made. We're going to build this application with Symfony2. So the next step is creating your project. There's a couple of ways of getting the basic Symfony2 code base. The first one is obviously just downloading a zip file or a tar file from the website. You go to symfony.com/download, you download the zip file, you extract it, and then you've got your project set up. You can do that. I would not recommend it. I would actually recommend using Composer. Now, Composer is a dependency management tool. So basically what Composer does is it looks at your libraries that you're going to use and then looks at the dependencies that those libraries have, and it will install those as well. So you don't have to worry about getting all the libraries together because Composer will handle that. And it has some really cool features. Like you can create a project based on a certain library. In this case, I'm using the Framework Standard Edition of Symfony. Now this is a pre-built distribution of Symfony with all of the common stuff in there. So it already has some other stuff, not just Symfony, but some other bundles in there that you will probably need when you build your application on top of Symfony. So what I do here is I say, okay, so composer.var, which is the executable for Composer, create project based on the Symfony Framework Standard Edition. Then my project is the directory that I'm installing this into, and I'm using version 2.3.4 for this project. When I do that, Composer will automatically start downloading all of the components that it needs, all of the libraries that it needs, and then it will also give me basic configuration questions. So right now, I didn't really answer any of the questions. I just used the default values. At some point, we will change that so that I can actually show you where the configuration is located. But it's an interactive process. So Composer will actually help you set up the project, which is really nice. And you won't have to manually do everything. And you will notice later on as well that Symfony has a lot of stuff like this, where it will interactively ask you questions and then generate some code for you, so you don't have to do it all manually, because that would take more time and you would probably make some mistakes at some point and you have to figure it out why it's not working. So then once you've filled out all the questions, it will clear the cache for you, it will install all the assets and stuff like that, and you're done. So one thing is that the logs and the cache directory should be writable, obviously. Otherwise, you would get errors immediately. Now, once I've done that, I've already got it set up. It's working. There's something in the browser when I go to this URL. Obviously, I haven't really set up Apache to have its own virtual host. I'm just going to it directly right now. I could set it up. I'm not going to go into setting up Apache because we're talking about Symfony today. So this is the default page when you go into the development environment of your application. And it will give you a lot of information, links to the documentation. You can there's a way to configure your project. So if you have database credentials now, you can actually click there and configure your project, and you can look at a demo as well, which can be really cool. If you're new to Symfony, it's interesting to look at stuff like that. And I haven't really done anything yet. The only thing I did was create a project, and all of a sudden I already have something to show you. But this is the basic directory structure that was just created with this composer create project command. So I have an app directory, I have a bin directory, I have a source directory, I have a vendor directory, and I have a web directory, and a couple of files. That's about it. Let's go through all of them. So the app directory is everything that is application specific. So you would find the configuration here, you would find the cache files here, you would find the log files here. There is some other stuff like the resources directory, which contains the global template that you can use in your application. Or yeah, you can use, you don't have to, but you can use it. But this is all like global application stuff. And then the other directories we're going to talk about later. One is interesting to note is the web directory. So the web directory is your document root. All of the other stuff should not be in your document root because there's configuration there. And since configuration are YAML files which are not parsed by Apache, if you would put the configuration inside your document root, people would just be able to guess the URL and get your database credentials, for instance, which is obviously not what you want. And since you can add stuff to the configuration as well, such as, I don't know, your API keys for the APIs you're connecting to, people could actually get stuff like that as well. So once you set up your Apache, make sure to point it to the web directory so that only the stuff that's in there is actually exposed via your web server. Now there's two important files in the web directory, which is app.php and app_dev.php. So app.php is basically the entry point for your production environment. So you set up your Apache to point to app.php as being the main entry point. Usually you would use something like mod rewrite for that, or what's the other, there's another Apache directive, I forgot about it. It's something like fallback resource, something like that. And then you can use app_dev.php to enter your development mode. If I have some time left at the end, I will actually show you this development mode because it is really useful for debugging your application. It will show you a lot about every piece of your application and what's happening there. So now that we've got it all set up, we can actually start doing something. We can start building our own hello world. So one directory I didn't really mention before in your project is the source directory. And the source directory is part of your project's root directory, and this is where all your custom code will go to. This is where you will create the code that will drive your application. Obviously, you could set up all of that manually, but luckily Symfony has a command for that. So if I do app/console, there's something falling off at the top, app/console generate :bundle, it will actually generate the whole directory structure and all the basic classes that it needs. It will generate it automatically for you. So the concept of bundles is that these are reusable components that you could use in other projects as well. And they bundle specific functionality together. So in this case, since I'm just creating a hello world application, I'm naming it sflive/hello world bundle. It always needs to end with bundle. If you don't make it end with bundle, it will actually give you an error saying, oh, okay, you need to end your name with bundle. So then the bundle name, it will automatically fill in based on what you said. It will automatically create the default values down there. So the bundle name is the sflive hello world bundle, and the target directory is this directory, which is the source directory of my project. And then it will ask you a couple of more questions, like what kind of configuration format do you want? There are several different configuration types. I like the annotation style best. Annotations are basically doc blocks on top of your classes and methods that are not just doc blocks, but they're actually parsed for configuration. And I really like that because then my configuration is actually part of my code instead of that it's put into a separate file. But you can use YAML, you can use XML, you can use plain PHP if you want to as well for configuration. For this example, I'm using annotations. So it asks a couple of more questions. It asks me to confirm that it will generate this directory structure and these files for me. And then it also asks me, do I want to automatically update my kernel class to use this bundle? And do I want to automatically update the routing to use this bundle? Now the first one is yes, because I want to start using this bundle, and to start using a bundle you need to add it to the kernel. If you don't add the bundle to the kernel, Symfony won't know about the existence of the bundle. So obviously I want that. And in this case I want to add it to the routing configuration as well, because it will be accessible through the web. If you create a bundle that, for instance, would only run cron jobs, then you don't need to add it to the routing because you won't have any web accessible content in there. So this is, you can either answer yes or no there depending on what the purpose of your bundle is. In this case, it's a hello world that needs to run in the browser, so I say yes. So now it has created for me in the source directory an SFLive directory, and SFLive is my main namespace for this application. And then underneath there is the hello world bundle, which is what I filled in the interactive configuration. And it already created like a default controller for me. It created a default view for me, some directories, a tests directory, because obviously we all want to test our stuff. And the bundle class. And the bundle class is just mainly there to show that this bundle is there. And you can, that's advanced stuff. I'm not going to go in there. So it all generated this for me. Obviously, again, you can all create this manually if you want to. But it will take you more time than just filling out these questions. And you might, make a typo somewhere and then it doesn't work and you have to look it up and stuff like that. Now, I mentioned the kernel before. So the app kernel is the main kernel class for your application. And it contains basically which bundles you want to use. So these are all the standard bundles that are in there with the standard distribution of Symfony. But it automatically added my SFLive Hello World bundle here as well. So by doing that, the application is actually aware of this bundle being there. And this is the routing.yaml. Again, if it's not readable, either come to the front a bit or check the slides afterwards. In the routing.yaml, it now added the routing configuration for this specific bundle. And what's happening here is it's saying SFLive Hello World bundle /controller/. So that means any controller I create in this bundle will automatically be checked to see if there's routing configuration in there and will be available through the web server. I'm also saying I'm using annotations here, which is what I chose earlier, and I've got a prefix that is /. So you can have multiple bundles that each have their own prefix. So I could have a blog bundle that would have a prefix blog, and I could have a news bundle that would have a prefix news. So this would be the prefix, and then everything I configure in the bundle controller would be put after this prefix, which can be really useful. Although it can also be really annoying, because if you're only looking at the controller, you're missing this prefix. So you might not figure out what URL maps to what. Okay, so there was this default controller, but I will ignore the default controller because that would spoil this. Instead, I create my own Hello World controller. So the Hello World controller is a very simple controller. It has one action, and an action method is basically a handler for a specific page. I've set it up with the route annotation to listen to /hello. So if I go to my web server, to my website, and I type in /hello, then it would go to this one. And I use the @template notation, annotation to say that it would need to parse the twig template for this specific page. Now you don't really have to worry about performance in this case because these annotations are actually cached. So it doesn't actually parse all these annotations on every request, but they are cached. Which is a good thing because otherwise it would get really slow. And then I created this hello world twig template which just says hello world. And if I go into my browser now and I type in /hello, it actually says hello world. So this is very basically creating a web page in Symfony. The flow being, you create a controller with a controller method, you create a template, or you don't because you can return responses directly from the controller, and then you go to the browser and it works. It's that simple. So obviously, hello world is not the only thing you usually build. Most of the time you have some dynamic content in there, for instance, stuff that connects to a database. So let's have a look at connecting to the database. Earlier on, I already showed you this. When I created the application, it was asking me for my configuration information. I didn't really fill in anything there. So my configuration file, the parameters.yaml file, which is located in app/config, it was empty. So for this, I actually created a database, and now I actually changed this information to, I'm using database user root without a password, which is really secure. The database name is my project, and the host is 127.0.0.1. So now Symfony knows about my credentials for the database. Now the next thing I need to do, Symfony uses either Doctrine or Propel for connecting to the database. Obviously, if you want to use something else, you can still use it. But today I will be talking about Doctrine. And to actually interact with the database, using Doctrine, you can create entities. And entities are classes that represent data. And this data can either be stored in a database or you can just use it in any way you want to. In this case, we're going to store it in the database. Symfony has a command for that as well, to create those entities. You can create them manually, I keep saying this, but there is a command. App console doctrine generate entity is an interactive, again, it's an interactive way of setting up a new class to connect to the database. So I'm using a blog post in this case. A very simple example. I type in sf hello world bundle :post, which will be the name of this specific entity, which will represent the blog post. And it will ask me what configuration do you want to use. I use annotations. And then it will ask me, okay, which fields do you want in this entity? Well, ID is always there. It's there by default, so I don't need to actually specify ID. So I basically say, okay, I'll have a title field, which is a string of a max length of 255. Then I have a content field, which is a text field, because it needs to contain more information. And then I have a publish date, which is a date time field. And then if I want to add more, I can keep on typing. In this case, this is enough for my example. So I just press enter again, and it will generate the code for me. Again, this is not really readable. This is a simple, plain old PHP class. There's nothing else. It doesn't extend any other class. It is just a class called post. And it has a couple of properties, and it has the getters and the setters for those properties. That's it. This is an entity. An entity is just a standard PHP class. The idea behind this, as opposed to, for instance, what Propel was doing before and what Doctrine was doing before, is that you can turn any standard class into a Doctrine object by just adding the configuration for it, which makes it a lot easier to migrate from a non-Symfony or non-Doctrine project into a Symfony or Doctrine project. And also you keep a good separation of concerns. This class is just responsible for keeping the data. It's just a data container. And then there's other stuff responsible for actually interacting with the database. So now would be the time to actually also create this specific table in the database. Because if it's not in the database, I cannot actually write to the database. Now I can do that manually, but there's again a command for that. I'm using here app console doctrine schema update. I would not recommend you use this for updating your production database because it might do some queries that you're not expecting it to do. There's actually a bundle that adds doctrine migrations, which would be a much better way of updating your schema on your live server, because then you can test it first on development server and stuff like that. But for just quick development, this is ideal because now I don't have to do anything. Symfony will actually create the database tables for me. So just to check before I actually do something, I use --dump SQL, so it will show me the SQL that it will execute on my database, which in this case is just a create statement for the post table with all the fields that I configured. And then I say --force to actually force it to execute this query. So now, when I look at my database, it actually created the post table with an ID, which was there before, a title, a content, and a publish date, where the title is a varchar 255, content is a long text, and publish date is a date time, which is basically what I specifically told Doctrine to use when I was creating the entity. Now, to show you more about the whole interaction with the database, I'm going to cheat a bit. I could create it manually, but I'm actually going to use this, Doctrine generate crud, which will create a basic crud interface on top of my table. This can be a good starting point if you want to start building your application, but this is really, really basic. So usually you just create your own stuff. But for this example, I'm going to use that one. Again, it will ask me a couple of questions like what entity will this crud be for? What is the root prefix? Stuff like that. And then do you want to confirm generation? Sure. And now I have this new controller, the post controller, with all these methods. There's an index action for the list. There is a create action for the creation. The new action is for handling the creation. The show action is for displaying one single post. The edit and update action are for actually updating the post. And there's a delete action for deleting it. It will generate all of that for me. Now let's look at the index action. The index action is very simple. So Doctrine, to get stuff from the database, there is a separate class called a repository. And the repository class is used for fetching data from the database. So by default, there is, if there is no repository for your specific entity, it will use the built-in Doctrine repository. But you can create your own repositories as well and your custom methods for fetching very specific data from the database. The default Doctrine repository already does some basic stuff, like find all to get all the records in the table, find by, and then a field name to specifically search for that field name. So if I would do find by title, it would actually look for any entry in the title column of my post table to see if there's a match on the parameter that I pass. And so creating custom methods is usually what you do when you need specific data sets from your database. So in this case, I get the repository and I do a find all, because this is just the index page, which has a listing of all the blog posts. And then I return an array here. Now the reason I return an array here is because I have the @template annotation. And the @template annotation says there should be a template in the resources directory, in this case, the post directory of the resources directory, because this is the post controller, so there should be a directory in your views directory called post as well. And then because this is the index action, it starts looking for index.html.twig. So this is a default mapping. I can specify it to use another template if I want to, but this is the default. And because I return an array, Symfony will automatically fetch this view and render the view and return a response based on that. So this is, if you're looking at fetching data, you use the repository. If you're actually looking at persisting data into the database, saving it to the database, this is basically the only lines you need. It's getting the manager from Doctrine. The manager is responsible for persisting to the database or removing from the database if you delete something. Then calling the persist method onto that manager and passing the entity that you want to save to the database. And Doctrine will look at the object you passed, look at what the mapping is that you configured for this specific entity, and then create the query to save that to the database. Persist is used both for creating new records and for saving or updating existing records. And then, very important, don't forget to flush. Basically, that's committing your transaction. If you don't, okay, this sounds really strange. If you don't flush, shit will happen. Because it will not actually execute the query and save it to the database. And so you think, well, I persisted it to the database, right? And it doesn't show up in the database because you don't flush. Now let's talk about Twig. So, anyone here worked with a templating engine before? Any templating engine? How many of you worked with Smarty before? I feel really sorry for you guys. Twig is like Smarty, but better. If you're familiar with Smarty, you will recognize a lot of the syntax. It's slightly different, but it looks really similar. Thing is with Twig is object-oriented, so it's very easy to extend and add new functionality to it, stuff like that. And it's very optimized. A lot more optimized than Smarty was when I was using it. But that's, I don't know, 8, 9 years ago. So this is a Twig template, a very basic Twig template. This is actually the base template that is in your project. So it's at app/resources /views/base.html.twig. There is curly brace %, which is the syntax for executing a command. And there is curly bracket for basically echoing. So what you see here is very basic Twig. It has a couple of blocks, and blocks are pieces of content that you can override in subtemplates. So subtemplates is Twig has inheritance. So a more specific template can inherit a base template. So this is the basic stuff that will be shown, which is not a lot, which will be shown if you open an empty page. And then in a subtemplate, I can inherit this one, and I can fill in these blocks to override the blocks that are specified here. So, okay, let's go into this body block, which is empty here in this one. If I go to this one, which is the template for the index page that I was talking about earlier, you will first see at the top that it extends base.html.twig, which is this template. It extends that one, and then it adds to this body block this content. So because I use the same name here, it will add that to the body block in this one. So all of this will end up here, just beneath the body tag of the HTML. Now I could even create another subtemplate, so another template that inherits from index.html.twig and that overrides, for instance, the title block, something like that. That's the inheritance in Twig. You can have several levels that each override a specific block. If I would create a new template that inherits from index.html.twig and I would override the body block, that would mean this would never show. Instead, it would show whatever I put in there. So that's inheritance in Twig. It allows you to layer your stuff. And basically, here, it's sort of used as a decorator because this is my basic template, and then this is my page-specific template. So, a couple of things to note. So Twig has several standard methods that you would use for any template, like for eaching over an array of entities, in this case, an array of blog posts. There is for entity in entities. That's basically your for loop. There's also if statements that you can use, like this one. If entity.publishDate, if there is a publish date, then show the publish date. Otherwise, you wouldn't show the publish date. So there's stuff like that you can use. And then there's all kinds of helpers that are Symfony specific, like using this path. Path generates a URL so that you can use it for linking, so that if at some point you update the routing of this specific page, the links are automatically updated because you're using it here instead of using hard-coded URLs in your application. So in this case, this will generate a URL for post_show with the ID of this entity. So basically a link to the show page for this specific blog post. Now I have a configuration in my controller above the show action that says route/ID with the name post show. And this is the name that I use here to tell Symfony I want to link to this specific URL. And so if I do that, if I would render this, this would create href equals quote /1 for my first blog post, or /2 for my second blog post. It will generate that automatically. If I would update this route to be /view/ID, then the URL would automatically be updated instead of me having to manually change all these links. And then there's also filters. So if I have this entity.content here, which shows the content, if I would use HTML in there, Twig would automatically escape the HTML and show me the tags instead of actually rendering the HTML. Because Twig does automatic escaping of your content, so that you're pretty sure that you won't have any strange XSS security problems. However, for echoing this blog post to your visitors, you would want to have the HTML actually parsed because of your markup of your blog post. So there's filters like this, that with the pipe symbol and then a filter name, in this case raw, I can actually say, okay, so give me the raw content of this. So don't escape it. And this is a good idea because now you have to consciously escape the raw output, or output the raw data instead of escaping it. So you only get this problem if you actually specify that you need the raw content. Now raw is one thing, but there's other filters for, I don't know, new line to break and stuff like that that you can use. I guess I have to hurry a bit. So how does this data, because I'm actually for entity and entities, I'm looping over an entities array here. How does this data get in here? Well, as I mentioned before, in the index action, I return an array, and this array is automatically passed to my template so that I can loop over it. Oh yeah, this is showing that you can actually render a view yourself if you want to. So you can specify with a template, you can specify which template it will automatically parse and render and return to the browser. But I could also render it myself. So I can say response is this render, and then specify which template, and then pass this same array, and then I can return the response. Now this is exactly the same as what I did before with the add template, except now I'm doing it manually. I could, for instance, add some caching headers to the response before I send it to the browser. So I could, I don't know, modified add or whatever, e-tag, stuff like that. I could add it to the response before I send it back to the browser, which is really useful if you're going to build some scalable website that you expect a lot of visitors, stuff like that. So that's also possible. You can render templates yourself. This is also useful if you want to have templates for sending emails, for instance. So you can have a separate template for sending the email instead of generating all of the content of an email in your PHP class. It's a separation of concerns. So let's try and get through these forms a bit quicker. Forms are another basic thing. A lot of, yes, I know, thank you. A lot of, most of the projects will need some kind of forms to interact. Now you could use standard forms, just have the forms yourself and parse the forms yourself. But there's all sorts of stuff that you need to do like filtering the input, validating any input, stuff like that. That if you want to do it yourself, that's a lot of work. And Symfony has a forms component where forms are objects. And they can be just configured to do all that stuff automatically for you. And they can also be rendered by Twig. So Twig knows exactly how to display the form based on your class. The combination of forms and entities together, the entities for the actual data and the forms for generating the forms and validating them, is really, really powerful. Because if I create a form with a specific configuration and I pass an entity to it, it will automatically guess based on the entity configuration what type of form field I want. So I don't have to actually specify that myself. So if I have a date time field like the publish at, it will automatically create a date time field select box for me, stuff like that. So this is a form class. This is actually a form class generated by Symfony based on the post entity that I had. It has 3 fields: title, content, and publish date. It's bound to the post entity. And there's a name here. So the name is used mostly for the form fields that are generated. This is basically all I need to have a basic form set up. And this will actually look at, okay, so whatever data I get in, if it's part of the publish date, is it actually a format that is a date? If it isn't, then it will throw an error and give the user the message, okay, this should be a date instead of whatever you're passing right now. Which is really useful because that means that a lot of that stuff is done automatically. I don't have to really worry about it. So this is taken from the generated crud that I had. It's the create form method. And this sets up the form. So I do this create form. In this case, because it's a new entity, because it's a new post, this is a create form, I just pass an empty empty entity. Then I specify the action and the method that it should use. I add the submit button, obviously. And that's all I need to create this form object. And then here is the validation. So if the form is valid, then I can persist it to the database. And what happens here is that I don't have to pass the information from the form to the entity and then persist it to the database. The form stuff is doing all that by itself. So it will make sure that my title and my content and my date are entered into this entity. And the only thing I need to do is save it to the database. That's it. And then it will redirect me to the show page. That's not part of the form. This is important. Make sure that it's valid before you do anything with it, obviously, because you want to do the validation. Now, if it's not valid, it will just go back to the template, and in the template it will actually show an error message with my form field that was wrong, that wasn't validated correctly. This is also important, never pass the real form to the template. The form can create a specific view class that the view can render. So that's form create view, never forget that, otherwise you will notice. But so in my template, I just have a form function that I pass my form to, and it will automatically render it to this. So this was a varchar, title was a varchar, the content was a text, and publish date was a date time field. I didn't do anything. I mean, this is just this specific thing. This is really good, especially for development. Obviously, if you work with separate front-enders, they don't have any control over how to render the form right now. So what you can do, there's also functions that render just all the fields separately and stuff like that, which can be really useful for when you work with a front-ender that wants to have control over everything. Another advantage of this, as opposed to creating your own forms manually in HTML and then parsing the input manually, is that the form component automatically adds CSRF protection. So it automatically adds tokens to the forms that it validates once it's submitted, so that you don't get any CSRF injections in your, for instance, that deletes a user or updates a password automatically. So that's basically what I was talking about today. Choosing your framework, choose wisely, choose Symfony. Create your project, first hello world, connecting to a database, working with Twig, and working with forms. That's some very basic stuff. If you want to go a bit more advanced, today the new PHP Architect magazine got published, and one of the articles in there is an article of me building basically a very simple WeTransfer clone using object store, cloud storage. I'm also using Symfony2 for that. The code is all up on GitHub. So if you want to go a bit further than this, you can actually look at that application as well as an example of how to work with Symfony2. Are there any more questions? No questions. Oh.
So that little screen example you had at the end, where it's rendering the form.
Yeah.
I mean, does it put any sort of classes or anything behind those?
Not by default. There's no classes by default on those form fields, but you can configure classes and stuff like that in your form object.
Right.
If you want that, yes. Any more questions? No.
So can you go back to the form slide?
Which one? This?
No, the one before that. When you check if the form is valid.
Let's see. That's this one.
Yeah. Don't you need to submit it after that?
Well, this. So.
How does it bind the data, or how does it?
Because this is the create action. So the way this is set up, the controller has a new action which actually shows you the empty form, and then you have the create action which parses the post request. So if you get in here, you already know that it's been the form has been posted, and you're just handling the post.
If you get in here, it's valid.
No, it's posted. It's just posted, and then you check if the submitted data is valid. So the form component, or the form class, will actually look at the entity to see what type of values it would expect. And then if it all validates, then it goes through to actually this piece of code, saving the data and then redirecting you to the show page. And if this is not valid, so you never get into this if, it will just return it and parse the template with your with the error messages. It will show the error messages with the form fields that didn't validate correctly. Okay, any more questions? Yeah, sure.
I've only played with Symfony2. But
yeah.
One thing that, if you've got legacy libraries, for example,
yeah.
How do you plug those in? Are you supposed to do that as a bundle, or that's one thing I was very unclear about.
So legacy libraries, you can create bundles. If you're lucky, the legacy library is enabled for Composer already. You can obviously just.
It's not. I wrote it.
Okay, it's not you wrote it. In that case, if you wrote it, you should add a Composer file to your project, so you can actually put it into the Composer file as a requirement, so it will automatically install. Obviously, if that's not possible, you can create a bundle where you have that library in there. The most easy, obviously, is if it uses the same PSR0 naming scheme. Because then it can even be auto-loaded. If it doesn't, then you'll need to do some kind of auto-loading, add something to the autoloader to do that. But you can use Composer even for custom autoloading. So it's probably a bit of configuring your Composer to recognize how your library is set up. Okay. No more questions? Okay. So let's go back to the end. There's this page on Joined In. I would like to ask you to leave some feedback here. What did you like about my talk? What did you not like about my talk? How could I improve it? This is really useful for me because this is the first time I'm doing this talk. This is also the URL where I will publish the slides afterwards. So if you go to Joined In, you can also go to the homepage and then click on SymfonyLive London and then click on my talk. But this is the direct URL, which might be useful. Thank you.